Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sharon Horowitz. I'm a reference librarian in the Hebraic section. This program is co-sponsored by the Science, Technology, and Business Division, and I want to acknowledge the assistance of Jennifer Harvester, head of the Science Reference section, who together with her staff did a wonderful job distributing the flyers for the program, and also many thanks to my colleague, Ashley Kufia, Life Sciences and Medical Librarian in the Science Reference section, for her assistance and for agreeing to co-sponsor this event. Please welcome Ms. Kufia, who will tell you a little bit about her section.
Hi, I'm Ashley Kufia. I'm the Medical and Health Life Sciences Librarian here at the library. I also want to welcome you all here today, and after the event, to please have you go over and check out some of the lovely parts of our collection that we have pulled for your viewing pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. As you may know, the British burned the Capitol in 1814, and with it, the small congressional library. Thomas Jefferson then sold to Congress his collection of more than 6,000 books, although Thomas Jefferson's collection included 2 Hebrew books, a Hebrew grammar and a Mishnah in Hebrew with Latin translation. However, the systematic development of Hebraica in the National Library began in 1912 when a Jewish philanthropist named Jacob Schiff bought a collection of 10,000 Hebrew books, pamphlets, and manuscripts assembled by a book collector named Ephraim Dinard and gave it to the Library of Congress. Today, our collection numbers about 250,000. Our work includes selecting books to add to the collections, lending books to other institutions, and responding to requests for information, both online and in person, from members of Congress, students, professors, as well as the general public. 2 of our missions are to preserve and publicize our collection. One way we do this is by sponsoring programs like this one. And now a word about our speaker. Dr. Jeremy Brown is a physician and historian of science and medicine. He directs the Office of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health. 2 of his previous books are Influenza, the 100-Year Hunt to Cure the Deadliest Disease in History, and New Heavens and a New Earth, the Jewish Reception of Copernican Thought. This latter book, in fact, in 2013, Dr. Brown presented, and there's a video of it on the Ahmed website if anybody wants to watch that. Today, Dr. Brown will speak about his new book, The 11th Plague, which tells about interactions between Jews and pandemics through the ages. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Brown.
As any parent knows, it's very hard to choose a favorite child. And as any author knows, it's very hard to choose a favorite chapter. And so rather than discuss one of the chapters in the book, or maybe a couple of them, I've decided to share with you the fascinating story of the Jews and pandemics using some of the illustrations that appear in the book. But because we're sitting in this Library of Congress, we will focus on the illustrations that were provided to me by the library. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that I'm required to remind you that I am a government employee who works at the National Institutes of Health. And therefore, I want to tell you that the views expressed are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, or the federal government on the history of Jews and pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19. So let's begin with a question. Why would anybody want to examine this very strange aspect of Jewish history? I mean, aren't there enough books already out there on Jewish history? So let me share with you a little bit of background. Over the last 9 years or so, I've been writing a sort of a commentary on the Babylonian Talmud, all 2,700 pages of it. This commentary is called a blog, and mine is one of many blogs on the Talmud dedicating to exploring the wonders across those 2,700 pages of the Babylonian Talmud. My blog focuses on the intersection of medicine and science in the Talmud. And while I was writing some 370 posts on various topics, I discovered a wealth of material that addresses medicine and pandemics. And I collected this material, not quite sure what I'd ever do with it, and then COVID. So COVID was not my inspiration for writing this book, but rather the catalyst for writing the book. And what I discovered, rather to my surprise, was that plagues and pandemics have had an indelible influence on the history of the Jewish people. And yet, despite this, they remain an almost unnoticed topic as a topic worthy of study in and of themselves. Let me give you a couple of examples. Now, Jewish history has been written from many perspectives. There are single-volume works and some that stretch over a dozen volumes. There are multi-volume works on the history of Jewish literature and Jewish education. There are histories of Jewish women and of Jewish physicians and of Jews and wine. There are histories of Jewish philosophy and Jewish customs, Jewish poems, Jewish legal opinions, and there are histories of the Jews in specific countries and of a specific generation. There are, of course, histories of the diaspora and of Israel. Now, all of these histories tell a story rather than the specific story. They shed light on but one aspect of a history that is endlessly variegated. My book adds but one more color to the spectrum of books that make up the story of the Jewish people. I make no claim that having reviewed the history of the Jews and pandemics, we have now arrived at the way, the best way to understand Jewish history. This book does not suggest how to view all of Jewish history and that you should view it through the lens of pandemics. Instead, I hope that the book has added a new aspect of that history, for it is one that until now has certainly been overlooked. Here are some examples of how that history has been unnoticed. The 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia has a very brief entry for plague, which focuses mostly on plagues found in the Bible, and perhaps as a sign of the times, because it was published in 1906, there was an entry for cholera and nothing else. The most recent edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica from the 70s has one entry for Black Death and another for the plagues of Egypt, and dozens of scattered mentions of the effects of pandemics on both individual Jews and Jewish communities. However, there is no general entry for pandemics, nor, despite the precedent of the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, it has no entry for cholera. And in his recently published book, Belonging, a sweeping 700-page history of the Jewish people from 1492 to 1900, the great historian Simon Schama makes not a single mention of pandemics. And yet, plagues and pandemics have shaped Jewish history in countless ways. So let us now turn to some of that history, using, as I've said, the wonderful treasures that are kept in this library. Incidentally, the pavilion that we are sitting in is named the Whittle Pavilion, after Gertrude Whittle, who married a British factory owner in 1906 and who developed quite a taste for and a love of chamber music. She lived in Boston and here in Washington, and over the years she collected a large number of unique antique instruments, including some Stradivari. In fact, she owned 4 Stradivari instruments. And Gertrude Whittle later donated them to the Library of Congress rather than a museum, so that they could be actively enjoyed by musicians and the public, rather than just being locked up behind display cases. So if you've not already done so, please take a moment to look around this magnificent room as we remember Gertrude Whittle and her incredible donation to the American people. The first illustration that I'd like to share with you is this one, which shows the Jewish square, the Piazza Giuda, in the Jewish ghetto in Rome. We have the original book from where it came on display, so you should spend a moment looking at that original, and I reproduced that image in the book. This engraving was produced by Giuseppe Vazzi and published in 1752. The image shows several people engaged in commerce, casually chatting, going around their daily business, rather like you and I would today. But if you look just behind the fountain, and this is Italy, so there has to be a fountain, if you look behind that fountain, you will see a gallows. You see that? This gallows in the Jewish square was originally placed, or certainly was used, to punish those who broke the curfew during an outbreak of pandemic bubonic plague in Rome in the summer of 1656. Incidentally, this was just one of many waves of the bubonic plague that swept through Europe following the Black Death, and the Jews of Europe, of course, had to deal not only with the terrible bubonic plague itself, but also with the pogroms that followed them, in which the Jews were alleged to have poisoned the well water and so spread the plague. In fact, bubonic plague is the only pandemic that has 2 chapters in my book dedicated to it. The first describes, as I've said, the way in which the Jewish communities of Padua and Rome in Italy, of Hamlin in Germany, of Prague, and in the Promised Land itself in Palestine were affected by the terrible recurrent pandemics of bubonic plague. And the second chapter that I have in the book focuses on the pogroms that are often followed, and the legend that it was because the Jews were dying in fewer number, saved by their rules of kosher meat and ritual bathing, that the surrounding Gentile populations thought to raise the accusation. Jacob Zahalon, who died in 1693, was descended from a very prominent Jewish family in Rome. He wrote several works, but few of them have survived. One of those that did is called Otzer HaChaim, a treasury of life. And it describes his work as both a physician and a rabbi during the outbreak of bubonic plague in Rome in 1656. Now, that pandemic arrived from Spain, swept over southern Italy, killed, we think, around 1 million people. And in the Jewish ghetto in Rome, according to Zahalon, it lasted around 9 months. Bubonic plague typically happened in the late spring and lasted until the onset of winter or fall, because then it's too cold for the rats and the mice to come out of their burrows. So that's the period in which it usually sweeps. The disease began outside of the Jewish ghetto, but soon infected the Jews within its walls. Zahalon first described the lazarettos, where the sick would be sent to recuperate or die. Here is a translated excerpt. The Jews were forbidden to leave the ghetto, so this is Rabbi Jacob Zahalon writing. The Jews were forbidden to leave the ghetto and enter the city, as was their custom. 2 officers were sent to the ghetto to prepare a suitable place for a lazaretto, where the sick could be placed so that they would be separated from the healthy and thus prevent the spread of the pandemic. They ordered that the place selected for this should be the houses on the street along the river near the gate of the ghetto, known as the Gate of the Bridge, where they should be confined until cured. They appointed an officer, Monsieur Negroni, who came twice a day to look after the needs of the community and to enforce rigid isolation at a great penalty. They set up gallows near the gate to hang anyone transgressing these orders. They appointed a Gentile physician who remained confined in the ghetto and who ordered everyone affected to be brought to the lazaretto. And so there were strict curfews in place, as I said. They appointed this officer, Monsieur Negroni, who came twice a week to look after the needs of the community and enforce rigid isolation, and they set up these ghettos. And Zahalon continues, none were permitted to go out on the street, save physicians. Physicians had a pass, except at certain times to get food. At night, no one was allowed to leave the house. The guards patrolled the city, and if they found anyone, they would put them in a special prison. In general, only physicians were allowed to walk outside in the streets, but at a specific time of day, everyone was allowed outside to find provisions. And then he continues. Since the people were unable to go to synagogue on Shabbat Toldot, which is in the winter of 1656, I, Jacob Zahalon, preached in Catalana Street from the window in the corner of the house to the people standing in the street. So you've got the image of a rabbi leaning out of a second-story window, preaching a religious message to the people in the street because they were forbidden to go into the synagogue. At another time, I preached from Toscana Street, from the window of the house of Judah Gattingo of blessed memory, the people standing in the street to listen to the sermon. And throughout his account of the plague, Zahalon reminds the reader that it was God who saved him. Blessed be the Lord who did kindness to me and preserved me and saved me in order to carry out his will. I raise the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. Praise be given to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasto. And at the end of his account, at the very end of the account, Zahalon describes a bris, a ritual circumcision of a baby that was born to a mother during the pandemic. And the mother soon died after the baby was born. And he writes, this baby, he writes, is Ephraim Levi, and he is alive today. He wrote this about 20 years after the event. His name is Ephraim Levi, and he is alive today. And although the printed text of his story ends here, the manuscript copy adds a verse from Ezekiel, which is to this day recited at the bris. And I say to you, by your blood you shall live. And I say to you, by your blood you shall live. As the medical historian Edward Reichman has noted, it was a homiletic flourish which marked the community's rebirth after the tragedies of the plague. Now, Jacob Zahalon's account, and it's only a couple of pages long, his account leaves the impression that the Rome ghetto was very well run. There were public health ordinances and the same stay-at-home orders with which we are now, unfortunately, all too familiar. Although the penalties for those who defied them were a little bit harsher. The lazarettos served as the equivalent of today's hospitals, physicians made house calls, and the poor were fed with community funds. Ironically, some of the care and assistance provided in the Rome ghetto in the 17th century was not in place for the most vulnerable in America during its COVID-19 pandemic some 350 years later. In the 11th plague, I described several pandemic diseases that have affected the Jewish people, like bubonic plague, smallpox, cholera, influenza, and others. But there is also a section about the religious responses to pandemics, and a chapter on fasting, prayer, and pandemic theology. In the Talmud, there is an entire tractate which discusses natural disasters and which one of them would prompt a fast, as well as the prayers and the customs to be followed when such a fast was declared. Now, these disasters, they included war, prolonged drought, earthquakes, and of course, pandemics. And the first order of business was naturally to define what mortality rate constituted a pandemic. And so the Talmud asks, what is considered a plague of pestilence? If it is a city that sends out 500 infantrymen, so it's got that many soldiers at its disposal, and 3 dead are removed from it on 3 consecutive days, so there's 1 death per day from plague, this is a plague of pestilence. The sages taught if a city that sends out 1,500 infantrymen has a population of 1,500 men, like the village of Akko, and 9 dead are removed from it on 3 consecutive days, so it has to be 3 deaths a day, this is considered a plague of pestilence. And the dispute hinges on how many people must die per unit of time before an outbreak can be classified as what we today would call a pandemic or an epidemic, which is to say a local increase in the rate of illness or deaths from an infectious disease. And there are 2 initial opinions of the Talmud. One is that it's 1 death per day, or one that it's 3 deaths per day. However, in true Talmudic style, there are several conditions on the timing of the deaths. If all 9 died on a single day, no one died on the other days, or if 9 died, but it was a period of 4 days, this, the Talmud says, is not a plague of pestilence. And by the way, just to put this into perspective, there are no strict and agreed upon criteria to define what exactly we mean today by a pandemic or an epidemic. The World Health Organization also had to define what it meant when it said there is something called a pandemic. And in 2009, we encountered what the World Health Organization called a pandemic of swine flu. But the problem was of the World Health Organization's use of the word pandemic. Now, most people think of a pandemic as a disease that spreads and kills thousands of people. And the description is echoed in the World Health Organization's official use of the word pandemic as an infectious disease that, quote, causes enormous numbers of deaths and illness. But in talking about that 2009 outbreak, the World Health Organization used a more academic, a more narrow definition that focused only on prevalence, how many cases there were, and not on severity. And after this was pointed out by an astute CNN reporter, a World Health Organization spokeswoman announced that the organization had erred in using the more apocalyptic definition. It was a mistake, she said, and we apologize for the confusion, noting that the word painted a rather bleak picture and could be very scary. So we must define what we mean by a pandemic, and the Talmud does just that. Once the criteria for a pandemic have been met, then a fast day is declared. This was codified in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law that was compiled by Joseph Cairo in northern Israel and was first published in Venice in 1565. And he writes, "Over which troubles we fast and blow the shofar. Just as we fast and blow the shofar, the ram's horn, because of a drought, we also fast because of other troubles, such as the threat of war or the imposition of taxes, and so too for an epidemic." And what is considered an epidemic? And then he quotes the Talmud: if a city of 500 inhabitants has 3 deaths a day for 3 consecutive days, this is defined as an epidemic. If all died on the same day or over 4 days rather than 3, this is not an epidemic. And then he adds women, children, and the elderly, all of whom are not employed, are not included insofar as the calculation is concerned. So it's really only able-bodied men, working men, I suppose. And then he continues, if there's a pandemic in the land of Israel, those in the diaspora declare a fast on their behalf. So you may be healthy, but if your brethren in the land of Israel are sick, you should fast on their behalf. If there was an outbreak in one area and those who escaped were able to flee to another, both places must fast, even though they may be far apart. So you had to have this sort of brotherly recognition and this brotherly care for other communities. And then the Shulchan Aruch adds the following: if there was an outbreak of disease among pigs, we declare a fast because their intestines are similar to those of humans. And certainly if there was an outbreak among idolaters that spared Jews, we must still declare a fast. So here you see a very inclusive definition of why we would fast for an epidemic. And it's basically, it could be out there in the Jewish community that's not your community. It could be out there in the non-Jewish community. And it could also be a pandemic limited to pigs. It's fascinating that he would call this out. And so Jews are required to fast in response to a pandemic, regardless of whether it just spread to their community. They also had to fast, even if the outbreak remained only in the animal reservoir. And this requirement is eminently prescient because one strain of influenza, influenza A, infects not only humans, but several other mammalian species as well, and also birds. The animal strains may pass from one mammalian species to another, sometimes gaining virulence as they do. So the great influenza pandemic of 1918, which killed at least 50 million people worldwide, and about which I recently wrote a book, is thought to have originated as a bird virus that passed through a mammalian host, most likely pigs, before it infected humans. In 1975, a swine flu threatened the United States and led to the federal government to undertake an enormous and very controversial mass vaccination program. In 2009, as we've just mentioned, there was another outbreak of swine flu, which originated in Mexico. And so, the Jewish requirement to fast in response to an outbreak of flu in swine is, medically speaking, spot on. Now, this sensitivity to zoonotic infections was not just theoretical. There is at least one example of a prayer specifically composed to save animals during a pandemic. It is on a beautifully printed Hebrew sheet entitled, "A Prayer to End an Outbreak of Disease Among the Cattle." And it may have been composed in Italy in the late 18th century. It was brought to my attention by Sharon Horowitz, the reference librarian in the Hebraic section, and by her colleague Anne Brenner. I acknowledge both in my book, and am most grateful for their sharing this and other gems that the library holds on our topic. It reads, in part, Master of the universe, creator of the heavens who spread them out. I feel like a preacher right now. Master of the universe, creator of the heavens who spread them out in the celestial sky and over the land, who bestowed a soul in the people that dwell on the land and a spirit in all those who walk on it. You created all the animals, beasts, creatures, and birds of flight. What is humanity that you should remember it? What are people that you should visit them, that your divinity should pity them, that your honor and glory should crown them? You have made man master over your handiwork, laying the world at his feet. Flocks in their thousands, God's creatures, the birds of the skies and the fish of the oceans, so that the poor may have food to be satiated. Let all who seek God speak his praises. May their hearts endure forever. And so, he continues, as a result of our sins, these animals were smitten, and our sins prevented the good for them. The disease has started to attack animals and birds. How the animals sighed, how the flocks despaired, for God's hand afflicted them and scattered a plague in their midst. And he ends, the author ends, please God, save them, save the animals, and grant them a complete cure and healing to all flesh through your goodness and through your mercy, as it is written. God is good to all, his mercy extends over his creations. We beseech you, let your mercy be stronger than your justice. And ends, please God, please heal all the creatures, all the animals with a heart. Turn away your anger, annul the evil decrees for us and all Israel with abundant mercy, and end the plague that attacks all the animals and the beasts in the fields. And by the way, this is not the only example we have of this kind of prayer. In 1865, the West London Synagogue published a form of prayer to Almighty God to stay the pestilence among the cattle and to avert the approach of cholera. Unusual though this prayer may seem at first, it was not a uniquely Jewish expression. In England, the Anglican Church added a prayer for the relief of cattle mortality in 1748, and it was said daily for the next 11 years. When bovine disease recurred during an outbreak of cholera in 1865, 3 new prayers were composed for the Anglican service. But still, those prayers could be controversial. In 1754, a cleric, correspondent of the London Evening Post, complained that the prayer for the relief of disease in the cattle had, quote, nothing of the spirit of the gospel in it, and was an invitation to the congregation to be carnally minded. Again, fasting to avert a pandemic is not unique to Judaism. Great Britain proclaimed national fast during the outbreaks of bubonic plague in the 1500s and 1600s. And during the 19th century, there were no fewer than 5 general fasts declared. So the government declared a general fast in Great Britain, but only one of these was on account of the threat of a pandemic. In February of that year, as the cholera approached, King William IV issued a proclamation for a general fast to be observed on March 21st, 1832. It came as the country was threatened by, quote, the progress of a grievous disease heretofore unknown in these islands, and called on the king's subjects to pray that God avert those heavenly judgments which our manifold provocations have most justly deserved. In London, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue heeded the call, published a special order of prayers for March 21st, 1832, quote, being the day appointed by His Majesty's special command as a general fast. So the Jewish community in London took part in a general fast that was to be observed by all of the population of Great Britain. And across the ocean here in the United States, the fledgling republic also grappled with declaring its own days of fasting, while not overstepping the constitutional boundaries that prevented both federal and state authorities overstepping the constitutional, from enhancing religiously motivated laws. In July 1832, President James Monroe and the Congress of the United States proclaimed a day of fasting and prayer. And this is their declaration. I do therefore recommend the 3rd Thursday in August next. I'm not going to do an American accent, but it would have sounded like that. Do therefore recommend in the third Thursday in August next, as a convenient day to be set apart for the devout purposes of rendering the sovereign of the universe and the benefactor of mankind the public homage due to his holy attributes, of acknowledgement of the transgressions which might justly provoke the manifestations of his divine displeasure. And we're going to pray, it says, that we should come under his care, that he would guide the public councils, animate their patriotism. I'm not sure what patriotism has to do with the threat of cholera, but animate the patriotism and bestow his blessing. And so that was in 1812. Later, in 1832, the cholera outbreak in the United States gave leaders and politicians the opportunity to join what one historian has called a tacit acknowledgement of civic Christianity. But despite a strong push from the church authorities and indeed from members of Congress, President Andrew Jackson refused to declare a national fast day because of the cholera. And he agreed that prayer was efficacious. It's not that he didn't believe in it, but he felt that such a declaration would transcend the limits which are prescribed by the Constitution for the president. So we had one president who proclaimed a national fast, another who said, I'm unable to do so because of the important separation of church and state. Now, prayers were not only offered and composed when a pandemic began, there were prayers of thanks offered when they came to an end. In my research, I learned that both the content of the prayers that were offered and the form that they took in these specially printed books for the services, they can teach us a great deal about the communities in which they circulated. Perhaps the best example is the contrast between two pandemic prayers of thanks offered almost a century apart, one in Italy and one in England. In 1767, the Jewish community of Mantua in Italy produced a lavishly illustrated prayer book on the occasion of the recovery of Empress Maria Theresa from smallpox. That book is here today and again brought to my attention by the wonderful staff here. The book, with its many cherubs, you can see some cherubs here, some more little cherubs, winged angels, and Italian translation, seems to be addressing an audience far beyond the community of Mantua, and this was in fact the case. When Maria Theresa, who was the youngest daughter of Marie Antoinette, when she contracted the smallpox at the age of 50, her illness became a national affair. She had lost 2 children already to the disease and would lose a third, and she herself was not expected to recover. And when she did recover, an intense feeling of relief spread over the city, wrote one historian, and showed itself in every form of ceremonial rejoicing. In June and July of that year, there were celebrations in at least 30 churches in Vienna alone, and a newspaper of the day noted that officials, quote, practically vied with one another for supremacy in the setting of the music, the decorations, the lighting of the churches. It's little wonder then that the Jewish community of Mantua produced its own prayer book to commemorate the auspicious recovery. Here are some of those images from the copy held by the Library of Congress. Oh God, it writes, in both Italian and in Hebrew. I translated it from the Hebrew because my Italian's not that good. Oh God, we beseech you to remember for the good the honorable empress, the righteous queen, and all the good that she does day and night without end to all the people who are under protection. She is as a mother who leads her children with great care and does good to all the house of Israel under her reign, just as her ancestors did, for they were compassionate. O God, heal the honorable empress, the queen, for whom we pray. Have mercy and compassion on her. Heal her and her ailments, and enlighten the eyes of the physicians who are caring for her. That's a nice addition. O King of kings, whose strength has no limit, in whose hands are the fates of all that is living, for your years are without end. Look down with providence and a kind eye on the rulers and dukes of the land, as just as you healed Hezekiah, who lived after his illness, and you lengthened his days. So too, add to the life of Our Lady, the Empress and Queen. And as for the princes and princesses of her family, add days, as it is written, add days to the days of the king. May his years extend through the generations. So this book, which again you can see over there, and I do encourage you to go take a look. This book was much more than just a service of thanksgiving, right? It was an impressive demonstration of the loyalty of the Jewish community of Mantua toward their sovereign. And for this reason, the prayers made absolutely no mention of human sin. To have suggested that the disease was caused by human sin would have been grievously insulting to the empress and perhaps even treasonous. And so the Mantua prayer book is full of praise and fawning compliments with absolutely no measure of sin. The prayer of the Jews of London was a stark contrast to that of the Jews of Mantua. In 1850, that's the proclamation I wanted to show you when I was talking about it. In 1850, a cholera epidemic came to an end in London, and the United Congregations of the British Empire published a pamphlet of thanksgiving to be used in all of its member congregations. This is a copy of that pamphlet. I did not take this from the Library of Congress. I don't know if you hold one. It came up at auction, actually, and I truly regret not having bought it. It would have been terrific. It was a few dollars, maybe $60 or $70. What a terrific collection, addition to a collection that would have been. Anyway, I did take a picture of it from the auction catalog. So in 1850, a cholera epidemic came to an end, and the United Congregations of the British Empire published a pamphlet of thanksgiving to be used in all of its member synagogues. The prayers, which were to be recited on Thursday, November the 15th, were accompanied with an English translation. It referred to the cholera as a mysterious illness, which at the time indeed it was, though it was going to be only another 4 years until John Snow would famously identify a contaminated water supply as the source of the cholera outbreak. And we'll read from it. Thy chastising hand, think about that, chastising hand. This plague comes to us because we have sinned. Thy chastising hand had lain heavily upon the inhabitants of this land. The stoutest heart trembled at the voice of death, sounding at the threshold, and the boldest among the mighty were seized with terror and anguish. But gracious and merciful art thou, O Lord. Your wrath endured not long, nor is thine anger everlasting. In the depths of our terror and affliction, you sent forth your spirit, and there was a pause. Thou commanded, and the plague ended. As both the Hebrew prayers and their English translation make clear, the Jews of London considered the outbreak of cholera to be a punishment. Grant that we may understand, they wrote, how full of blessings are the chastisements of thy hand, that we may learn thereby thy statutes and cease to sin against thy holy laws. Sin was the reason for the outbreak, and the Jews had learned their lesson. Oh, let us therefore ponder our ways so that we may ever remember the past affliction and provoke not its return. As we noted earlier, cholera was widely thought to have been a divine retribution for sin. The proof was its predilection or supposed predilection for the poor, for the drunk, and the morally destitute. One physician wrote that the probability of an outburst or increase of cholera I believe to be heightened on holidays, Saturdays, Sundays, and any other occasion where there are opportunities afforded to the lower classes for dissipation and debauchery. When the Jews of London thanked their God for saving them from cholera, they were doing so in a particularly British way. The content of these prayers of thanks from Mantua and London were not, as one might have thought, the insulated creations of each Jewish community, but rather they mirror both the beliefs and the expectations of the wider non-Jewish community in which each had been composed. Another important example of Jewish prayer for the royal family threatened with a pandemic was composed by the German scholar Naphtali Herz-Wessely, who died in 1805 and was published in a Hebrew journal, Ha'Ma'asef, in 1789. O merciful God, he says, save the firstborn crown prince Friedrich Wilhelm and his brother, the delight of the word Prince Ludwig and their brother, Heinrich Wilhelm, and their sister, the pleasing Augusta, daughter of the king, all of whom are currently isolated at the instruction of their doctors, who are trying to save them from smallpox, which has spread and affected many. We beseech of you, O God, writes Wesley, stand at their right hand of the physicians, assist them with their advice and support their actions. May they succeed in all that they do, for you are a healing and true God. May you bless the king and his house forever. As I come to an end, I'd like to inject a personal note. Almost a decade ago, as Sharon mentioned, it was September of 2013, I was fortunate enough to be invited to this library to give a talk about a new book that I had written on the history of the Jewish response to Copernican thought. It was a great thrill back in 2013 to stand in the magnificent paneled Rosenwald room in the presence of some of those books that I had cited, and quite frankly, it's a thrill it's an event that would thrill any author. I had no idea then that 10 years later, I would be back discussing a book about Jews, plagues, and pandemics, and having just lived through a worldwide pandemic. The future, it seems, holds a lot of surprises, and I do look forward to coming back in 2033 to share with you another book on the history of the Jewish people, though on what it will focus, I have no idea. There is only one ironclad law of pandemics. They all come to an end. The question is how much damage they cause until each is finally extinguished. And the cost is, of course, first and foremost, the toll of human life and the misery afflicted. But in addition to the morbidity and mortality, there are social and financial costs, mental health challenges, religious questions, communal upheavals, and reconfigurations. For those who lived through COVID-19, the challenges were not borne equally, and pandemics have always served to magnify existing social imbalances and inequalities. However, they have also provided for an opportunity to refocus and appreciate the truly important things in life. This, after all, is the role of the Jewish requirement to make a blessing over a multitude of both mundane and special events. Blessings make us pause, reminding us not to take the familiar for granted or to allow the novel to go unnoticed. Perhaps then, it is time to reinstitute the blessing found in the Talmud, which later fell out of use. It was composed by Yehuda bar Nachmani, who was the secretary to the far more famous sage known as Reish Lakish, and it was uttered at the end of a pandemic. Blessed are you who ends the plague. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take any questions. We've only touched on a small sliver of what the book contains. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for a wonderful timing.
You have to sign a waiver first before you ask.
I signed my waiver. Thank you. Thank you for amazing, really, a great presentation, and to Sharon for organizing. The question I had, you mentioned quite a bit about animals being a source, perhaps, or at least spreading. And now that Passover is next week, the idea of pestilence. Do you mention that in your book? I mean, I know that's divine, but nonetheless, it's just the idea that it's a plague that exists already, at least in biblical.
Yeah, I have a chapter. Thank you for the question. The first chapter of the book looks at plagues in the Bible, and of course, there are 10 plagues in the Bible that we know about. There are several that appear later on. The book is called The 11th Plague, which I explain in the introduction is a stand-in for all of those plagues that affected the Jewish people that came after the 10 plagues. But yes, I do focus to a good degree on the 10 plagues, on the way that they are recounted in the 5 books of Moses. Interestingly, in the book of Psalms, some of them are not mentioned, and the order is messed up, so it may be that there were separate traditions about how many plagues there were that eventually came together. There have been a number of scientific theories about the origin of the plague, including, and I go through all of these, volcanoes, algae blooms, El Nino, an El Nino effect, so that you could climate change. But it's interesting, in the book, I mention, for those of you who are going to celebrate Passover, this is a nice tidbit. In the Torah mentions that the plague of pestilence happened in the field. And a rabbi in the 1750s, whose name I'm forgetting because there are hundreds of rabbis who I mentioned in the book, a rabbi in the 1750s said, why did the text of the book of the Bible have to say the pestilence attacked the animals in the field. That's where animals go. They're in the field, right? Every word has to have meaning. And he writes, well, it wrote this because of the following. We know, he says, writing the 1750s in Hebrew, in his Hebrew explanation of the Haggadah, we know that plagues and pandemics are caused by the miasma, by the sick, polluted air that rises up from volcanoes or from swamps and so forth. We know that. That's the scientific theory of the day. So you would have thought that putting the animals in the field far away from the swamps and the miasmas would have saved them. And therefore, God wrote in his Bible, in the Torah, that the dever affected the animals in the fields, because you wouldn't expect them to die there. You would expect them to die in the swamps. So my point is, there has always been a Jewish sort of pastime in trying to apply a scientific understanding to what happened in the Bible. So there are many explanations or supposed explanations of what happened. That was the cause of the 10 plagues in the Bible. I probably would be a bit of a downer if I sat at your Seder, because I write in the beginning of the book. Passover's coming in just over a week. I write in the beginning of the book, and during the Passover, during the Seder ceremony, we dip out one drop of wine, as we mentioned the 10 plagues. We spill wine. We show that we're sorry that this had to happen. It's a lovely idea. No gloating. Except we do have gloating, right? My children used to get finger puppets with the 10 plagues. You can get fingernail decals with each of the 10 plagues, right? So there's some remove here. It's become a thing we talk about. We throw ping pong balls for hail, and my family has little plastic cows that we turn upright on the table. It's a whole thing. Anyway, but look how removed I am. Look how removed we as a people are from disease that was just incredible. And there other people lived through it too. So, yes, that's a long answer to the question of, do I discuss the plagues of the Bible? I do at great length, and it was a fascinating area to look at. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful address. Going back to the Bible, not only do we have the 10 plagues and other issues like that, but we have the, whatever we understand it as, tzaraat. And clearly that was what we call the leprosy in the Bible. We're not really sure exactly what disease that is. But there were two aspects of that, and to a certain extent you touched on one, and that was the curfew. But there, of course, you went, quote unquote, michutz lamachadeh. So to a certain extent you were quarantined. So did that carry over into many of the approaches to plagues? And the second is, we have the concept that the priest acted as a doctor, so to speak. He was the diagnostician. He would go to the priest on the first day or the seventh day and whatever, and he would follow through. Was that, whether it would be a priestly class or other approaches, was that seen in it, since it's clearly biblically related?
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for those terrific questions. First, the practice of quarantine, which comes from the Italian quarantino, meaning 40, because they would put a ship that came into port in quarantine for 40 days to make sure it wasn't bringing any disease. The practice of quarantine, of sending the diseased out of the camp, that has been known for centuries before what we have today as the germ theory. It's not a theory, we know what it is, but it's called the germ theory. So you didn't need the germ theory to tell you to stay away from people who had certain diseases. The Talmud itself says if there's a certain disease in a house, it says, don't go into the house, don't use the pots and pans, and stay far away from the flies. Now, they didn't know why this worked, but it certainly seemed to work. In the book, I mention other pandemics that took place in Italy, the pandemic in Padua in 1630, on which there is a much, much longer account written by a doctor called Abraham Catalano, who tragically lost his own wife of 21 years and his daughter Sarah to the bubonic plague that affected the Jews of Padua. And he has a very, very long account of the plague, which is absolutely spellbinding, and I reproduce a lot of it in the book. And in that account, he talks about moving people to quarantine, and people were afraid to go up the stairs into the house. You can also read modern accounts of this. We know in the 1700s there were quarantines. You weren't allowed to bring clothing into villages in England that had not yet come under the epidemic. So yes, quarantine was a well-known, well-described practice that took place, as I said, many, many centuries before we understood what germs were, and many centuries before that, even during the Talmud itself. Now, the second question that you asked about the Kohen, the high priest, being the arbiter of health, I think this is a great question. I think it's a unique aspect in this particular disease, tzara'at, which was seen as a disease of the spirit. The rabbis say that you get this plague for speaking ill of somebody, lashon hara. You speak badly of somebody, you tattletale on them, and God punishes you with this plague. And I think for that reason, the priest was involved in adjudicating the case. Did the person indeed have tzara'at, and had the rash disappeared? In general, we do have many rabbis who were doctors. I mentioned Catalano was one. Zahalon was another one. Abraham Yagel, who has an amazing plague thesis, which he writes about bubonic plague. I mean, it's really a large number, and really these were, of course, the most educated of the community. They were the elite. They weren't the everyday people, and it was to them that fell both the rabbinic decisions and also the medical decisions. Sometimes, of course, the blend, the line where one ends and the other begins is hard to demarcate. So thank you. Those are two terrific questions.
All right, thanks for this. My question was, you had mentioned that the Jewish communities, they had lower rates of death and due to cultural practices like the bathing and food. Were there any instances of people who, in the wider community, who would see that and instead of saying, oh, it's their fault they did this, instead say, hey, maybe we should go into these communities and see what they're doing differently that we could learn from?
Yeah, wouldn't that have been a nice thing? They certainly did go into the communities, but not in the way that was particularly helpful. Look, I mentioned the theory that the Jews were dying in lesser number because of their religious practices. It's a myth. It's an absolute myth. I have a whole chapter in the book on this myth, in which I look at, number one, is it true the Jews were dying in lesser numbers than the Gentiles around them? And the answer is no. It depends. If you look at certain time slices, there were fewer Jewish deaths, for example, before the plague got into the ghetto. If you were living in a walled ghetto and the plague had come from the outside, naturally you were going to be the last person to get the plague, right? In fact, Catalano, the rabbi who lost his wife in the bubonic plague outbreak in Padua in 1630, he writes that in the ghetto, they sent the non-Jewish gatekeeper home on full pay, by the way. He mentions they sent him home on full pay because his wife had come down with what they thought might be bubonic plague, and he didn't want to bring it into the ghetto. So, of course, the ghetto was the last place to get it because it was sealed off, okay? But at other times, the Jewish communities were out. The death rates were far higher than the non-Jewish communities around them. Sometimes the plague broke out in the Jewish communities. And in the book, I do go into this in detail. And by the way, this myth that the Jews were dying in fewer number, and that's why the Christian communities around them attacked them, there's no evidence that they were dying in fewer number. For example, the Pope himself wrote that this is a terrible allegation to make against the Jews. There should be no attacking on. Nobody really listened to him. But the Pope himself, Pope Clement IV, who spent the entire era of the Black Death standing between two large fires that he was told by his physicians would keep the air nice and clean. The Pope himself said there's no truth to this allegation. The allegation is actually only first made by a Jewish writer about 200 years after the Black Death itself. It then trickles down through various Jewish writings, secondary sources. It's mentioned in the 19th century by a number of anti-Semitic writers who, although they were rabid anti-Semites, and this includes, by the way, a professor from MIT who wrote that yes, but although the Jews have their own physiognomy and they have different noses and so on, but the laws of Moses saved them. They die in fewer number. And again, if you look at the statistics, it's just not the case. It's just not the case. And this isn't the case, by the way, in Amsterdam during the outbreak of the plague there, where we have very good numbers from some Dutch researchers who looked at the death rate in the Jewish community. The myth is, it can be found actually on the website of Bet Hatfutzot, on the newly renamed, I can't remember what it's renamed, the Korot something, the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv has on its website this myth. And it says, it's not exactly clear, but this is the myth. And unfortunately, it is a myth. It's a myth that we have spread ourselves, unwittingly, I think. Beryl Wine, in his an Orthodox rabbi, writes about how the Jews died in lesser number because of their practices, but there's no evidence for it. And in fact, I have another section in that chapter about what I call biological plausibility. Does it make sense that if you were a woman who went to the ritual bath once a month, that therefore you would be at lower likelihood of death? Does it make sense that if you washed your hands ritually 3 times before eating bread, does it make sense that you would not catch bubonic plague? Does it make sense, as some later suggested, that because the Jews salt their meat to remove any of the blood, does that make sense that you wouldn't catch tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is not spread by food. The only disease that's spread by food, or in this case, is water, is cholera, right? So you can salt your meat from today to tomorrow. If you take a drink, you're going to get cholera. And so this myth, unfortunately, I think is a fascinating tale to retell. Sadly, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. The Jews did not die in lesser numbers. And the claim of what I call Jewish pandemic exceptionalism is a myth. If only it were true. The Jews, noted the late Rabbi Lionel Blue, the Jews are like everyone else, only more so. And the same is true of their death rates in pandemics.
Thank you, Professor. So I'm currently a student at Harvard University in graduate program psychology, and studying moral psychology. I have some notes on my iPhone. I just want to refer to them. But for instance, a recent paper, Chapman and Anderson, posit that disgust-driven moral judgments are an extension of our evolutionary reflexes. That is, just as feeling disgusted helps us avoid risky substances, it also pushes us away from those whose behavior signals danger to society. So there's this idea of the body's immune response, but also this idea, which is now quite well established in moral psychology theory, of a social immune response. And a lot of research has been done on the duality between purity and disgust, but disgust reflex as a means of policing behavior. So I just wanted to know if you could briefly speak to that, perhaps the role of rule-oriented behavior in the halakha, but also the idea of Jews as contagion in European society during the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a terrific chapter and a terrific question, and probably a good PhD in there somewhere. So you're on it. Okay. So yes, this idea of revulsion. We have the book, Holiness. What's it called? Purity and Pollution. Who wrote that? Mead, was it? I can't remember. Anyway, it's a well-established. You say we know that both the body is repulsed by certain things, physically repulsed. By the way, there is a theory that the reason women sometimes get hyperemesis gravidum or morning sickness. Well, I mean, why would evolution evolve to have us get morning sickness? And there is a theory that is to get rid of all the possibly poisonous food that you may have eaten. And I mean, it makes no sense to me, but that theory is out there. So in trying to explain morning sickness, we go to, well, it was an evolutionary response to possibly dangerous food. You know, you did point out that there are two aspects of this. There's the physiological and there's the moral. And yeah, I think in all societies, there is a moral outrage at certain things, and that outrage enables the members of the group to coalesce around each other. And in fact, there is a description of this. There's a name for this in social psychology. It's called credibility-enhancing displays, or creds. And credibility-enhancing displays are things that the community does, whichever community it is. Anabaptists, Amish, Buddhists, Jews, agnostics, atheists. There are things that people do within a community to show that they are a true member of the community and you can rely on them. You can rely on them. That's why these credibility-enhancing displays evolved, because you needed to know who is in my group of 20 and who's outside my group of 20. Who can I trust and not trust? So I think it's a very interesting thing to look at, is these credibility-enhancing displays that we see, whether they are in the Jewish community, the evolution of stricter and stricter interpretations of law. Because if everybody is eating kosher, then you have to eat super kosher. And if everyone's eating super kosher, then you're just like everyone else. You have to eat super kosher. And the reason is it's a credibility-enhancing display. It's to signal to people, I'm a member of this part of the Jewish community and not that. How do I show that to you? Because of what I buy or how I dress. And again, you can find this in all communities, religious, non-religious. It's a fascinating thing to think about. And I think, look, evolution is a useful tool, right? We evolved to appreciate credibility-enhancing displays because they do tell us on whom we can rely, right? If we didn't have that, we probably wouldn't be here today. So thank you. It's a terrific question, and good luck with that PhD. I'd love to read it.
Could you describe the practice of black weddings?
Oh, yes. Can you give me 2 hours? All right, so very quickly, thank you. It's a terrific question. Whole chapter in the book. Highly recommended. Makes a lovely Passover gift, or Easter gift. The black wedding. There was a practice in Eastern Europe. It began sometime in the 1800s, in which, usually during a cholera outbreak, although it could be typhus, usually during a pandemic, the village, the shtetl, which contained probably 20 families, 60 families, usually that kind of size, or the town, which contained maybe a few hundred, the village, either to ward off the pandemic or to prevent it from coming, would choose 2 orphans or 2 people who had handicaps, physical handicaps, 2 people who were unlikely to get married, and with their consent, bring them to the cemetery under a black wedding canopy, marry them. They would be supported by the community with gifts, with charity, and this couple would then remain married, and through this incredibly weird act, somehow plead with God and say, look, God, we just took care of these, what we call in Hebrew, nebuchs, these poor people, these down and outs, these outcasts, nobody would look after them. We got them together. We found them each other. We married them. We've given them money. We've given them a feather bed, and so on and so on. And may God, your mercy, extend on us, just like we extended mercy on them. It was a very widespread, very well-documented custom. In the book, I have an appendix where I list at least 20 records from Yiddish books across Eastern Europe where this custom was carried out. It was very widespread. And it took place in America. In 1917 in New York, there is a recorded wedding that took place to try and prevent influenza. Another wedding like that took place in Winnipeg, in Canada, the same year. And those 2 weddings were to ward off the pandemic influenza. The last recorded plague wedding that I knew about before COVID took place in Zeklevich, in a Nazi-controlled village. In Poland in 1942, there was a black wedding, which the account is in Yiddish. I'm not a fluent Yiddish speaker or reader, so I had it translated. And actually, in Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 of the book, the entire account of that wedding in Yiddish is translated, a free translation of what happened. And I thought, and there are pictures, by the way, there are pictures, I thought this took place in Jerusalem, it took place in Sfat, as I say, it took place in in New York. And I thought that the plague wedding that took place under the eyes of the Gestapo in 1942, I thought that was the last record ever of a plague wedding. And indeed it was, until 2020, when there were pictures that circulated, and you can find these easily on the internet, there were pictures that circulated of a wedding of an ultra-Orthodox boy and girl. I do not know if they were orphans. I do not know if they were suffering from a disease. I don't know who they were. Maybe they were just, volunteered for this or were voluntold for this. I don't know. But there is a picture. It takes place in the Ponovich Cemetery in Bnei Brak. Of course, this is the modern era, so we have drone footage of this now. Right? You have a drone. It's quite startling. There are not many people at the wedding. And among the freshly dug graves of the Ponovich cemetery in Bnei Brak in Israel, a plague wedding took place, I think it was in 2020, 21. So that's the last recorded plague wedding. So it's a very interesting aspect of Jewish folklore. I also include some of the pushback against it. Some rabbis tried to contain it, some banned it, but by and large, this was a populist uprising, a populist response to plague, and the rabbis could do very little about it. And one last thing, they were nearly always recorded as having tremendously joyous events. There was liquor flow. The one in New York that took place in New York in 1917 talks about the liquor that was flowing from the people as they were standing amongst the cemetery, looking at this. There was jokes and there was liquor, and it was by and large it was a very joyous occasion, which is kind of odd, a black wedding taking place in a cemetery to ward off a pandemic. I do talk about that and the theories behind that, but yet it's quite a story. It's quite a story.
Okay, on behalf of everybody here, let me thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.